let's talk about swearing. So hey everyone, and welcome back to another video, and this video isn't very like me because if you've been around a while you might realise that I don't really swear a lot unless I'm reading Bella Thorne lyrics, in which case you have to because the poetry. Oh, I love the way she say that mine, never break up, but I you like it's makeup sex. You can run and tell all your friends, my the best. But in general, I don't really swear all that much in my everyday life or in my videos because it's just, I don't know, doesn't really come naturally to me. That said, I am very interested in the words in terms of their origins and why we use them, and that's kind of what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about swearing, insults, why we use the words we use, where they've come from, why some of them are so offensive, and I want to talk about reclaiming words that have traditionally been sexist or homophobic or transphobic or racist. I want to talk about the history of these words, and I want to talk about if there's ever a reason or a place we can use them and why we shouldn't use them. Now, obviously, I can't speak from experience about a lot of these words and these things and these insults, and I'm not even going to try and pretend to understand what it's like for example, people of colour or people who are transgender. They have their own experiences, and I don't want to speak over or pretend to speak for anyone else. I can't do that, which is why the main focus of this video is going to be a word which Ofcom has deemed the most offensive word there is, and one which does affect me because I am a woman. But we'll get to that in a moment. Before we actually jump into any of that, one thing I want to note is that I'm going to be asking a lot of questions in this video, like I'll make a statement and then say like, is this okay? Why do we think this? Or, well, if X is okay, then why isn't Y okay? And I want to make it very clear now because I've made these kinds of statements in these sorts of videos before, and I thought I made it clear, and I still have people angry at me. But basically, I'm literally just asking these why questions because I want you guys to think for yourself about both society's reasons and your personal reasons for why something is or isn't right or wrong. While something might obviously seem wrong, I want you to think about why and not just the, well, because it is. If I ask, well, why is X okay and not Y, I'm not saying, well, both X and Y should be okay. I'm literally saying, I want you to think about the why. It's a genuine question. And I know a lot of people think that these kinds of disclaimers aren't necessary at the start of videos like this, but you're not the ones who have to deal with 3 pages of hate spewed at you because someone listened to one question and not the other 30 minutes of a video. So the idea for this video came from 2 main places. One is that I was watching Black Wolf Company's video series on Jeffree Star and Shane Dawson. Yes, I sat and watched all nearly 3 hours of it because, what can I say, I'm a fan of Black Wolf Company, not Shane Dawson or Jeffree Star. Anyway, and in that video I saw a clip in which Jeffree tried to justify a video of him angrily calling some people on the street the N-word by saying, but it wasn't like it was racially motivated, those girls were white, as though that makes it okay. And so that kind of started me thinking about like, well, hang on a minute, we know it's not okay, even though he's trying to justify it, so why isn't it okay? And I started this whole thought process about thinking like, you know, well, Jeffree, he knows the history of the word, he knows why it's derogatory, he knows he's a white man. I don't necessarily think in that context or any context it matters who you're saying it to. Ultimately, it comes down to what the word means and its history, and the fact that ultimately, what Jeffree was basically saying is, the worst insult I can think to throw at you right now is to say you're black, as though being black is a bad thing. There's obviously a huge problem with that, and then that got me thinking about other insults and how, well, okay, if that's essentially saying that it's bad to be black, other insults are saying that it's bad to be a woman, it's bad to be gay, it's bad to be disabled, for example. And it started me thinking about the origin of so many insults and how a lot of them that we just kind of use very casually are incredibly problematic. So many of the insults that we use today are actually relying on insulting and putting down whole groups of people who we see as inferior to us in some way. And there's a huge, huge problem with that. And as it happened, around the same time that I was going through this thought process and kind of like thinking about all this stuff, I started reading this fantastic book by Kate Lister called A Curious History of Sex, and it is fantastic, and if you've not read it, I really, really recommend it. I'm only about halfway through so far, and the bit that we're going to be referencing in this video is only like the second chapter or something, so I've not finished the book yet, and I already think it's fantastic. The first 2 chapters of the book open focusing on the word whore and the C word, amongst others, and talking about the origins of the word, where they came from, why they're insults, and can we reclaim these words? Should we reclaim these words? What is the history and the meaning behind them? And just ultimately, what do these words really mean? Why are they considered so offensive? And now the irony is that despite one of the main points I want to make in this video, I'm still feeling the need to censor myself and not actually say the C word out loud, because you guys might know, but YouTube age restricted my first Shane Dawson video. They've demonetized my second Shane Dawson video. They've demonetized a lot of my other videos at the minute, and it's a struggle. And so YouTube doesn't think that the C word, despite everything I'm about to say in this video, despite the fact that I'm using it for an educational purpose, despite the fact that we will see it wasn't originally an insult or anything necessarily bad, it's not anything to be ashamed of, YouTube still thinks it's completely inappropriate. It's not ad friendly, it's not family friendly, it's not a good word, it's not a clean word. And there's a lot of irony in that, and I kind of want you to think about that as we go through the video. Because the point I'm trying to make is that this word shouldn't necessarily be an insult or a bad word, a naughty word, a swear word, but I'm still having to self-censor myself because I need to pay my bills, you know? Let's get into the actual meat of this video, because like I say, today's video, inspired by Kate's book, I want to look at the history of the C word and share my thoughts on it as a woman, and then hopefully at the end, I am at the end going to be asking you guys a lot of questions and trying to open up a discussion about this and other insults and slurs, ultimately with the goal of making us all a little more conscious of the language that we use every day, and also of the language that we don't use and why. Now, as always, I want to be as inclusive and open and welcoming as possible in my videos and on my channel. Everyone is safe and welcome here. So I want to open with, basically I'm going to read you something that comes straight from Kate's writing in the book, because she says it better than I ever could. She writes, "Today we know that some women have and some do not, just as some men do and some men do not. But our ancestors did not view gender or biology in such terms. They understood as being a woman's genitals. While this might be offensive to modern ears, understanding historical attitudes to gender identity and sexual morphology is essential if we are to fully appreciate how heteronormativity and constructs of the binary of masculine and feminine came to dominate cultural narratives today." When we talk about using a word for the vagina, for example, as a slur against women, it's important that we take into context the context, and that is that at the time, everyone thought only women had vaginas. And so we need to discuss it within the context of that group and their beliefs, not necessarily what we know today to be true, which is that gender is actually a lot more complex. So when I say at the time, people using a slur against the vagina were trying to put down women, that's not me saying only women have vaginas. That's me saying, understanding the cultural context at the time and what people believed at the time, this is what they were doing. It's important to be aware of what we know today and how our understanding has changed and developed and grown, but you can't just ignore historical and social context. Does that make sense? So as a personal example of how kind of like, what happened to me, when I first started YouTube, in one of my videos, I was critiquing some fundamentalist religious book like I do. Might have been something by like Debbie Pearl or someone like that, but basically it was some book about gender roles written by some woman, and she definitely had this like narrow, offensive belief system, and she made it very clear in her book and her other writing that, you know, she thought only men have penises, only women have vaginas, gender is determined by your sex and only your sex, homosexual couples are wrong, transgender people don't exist, men need to do X at home, women need to do Y at home, men and women are different because of this, this and this, and blah blah blah. And basically they were all her beliefs. So all my critiques were in the context of understanding that that was her belief system. And in one part of her book, she made some comment about how women were made to be in the kitchen and men weren't, and blah, blah, blah. So in response to this, I made some sarcastic joke about how, like, oh yeah, she's totally right, because we all know men can't go near ovens because their massive penises get in the way. And I got so much backlash for that joke because everyone called me transphobic. I found it odd because I was like, because I thought it was clear that my intention was the exact opposite. My aim there was to, like, literally point out, here's a person who thinks penis equals man, vagina equals woman, and that somehow affects skills like cooking. And it was to make a sarcastic joke at that person's expense and how wrong their entire belief system was. My aim, in my eyes, was not to say, I think only men have penises and transgender people don't exist. In my eyes, the aim of my joke and commentary there was to point out how ridiculous her, like, narrow-minded views and entire belief system was, and to actually point out that gender and our gender expression and the idea of gender roles in general are far more complex than Debbie or whoever was writing was making out. But people didn't bother to take that context into account, and they just kind of ran with it. And it annoyed me a bit. And so that's why I think it's important to kind of mention these things. And it's important to look at words in context and understand their meaning. And I tell this story because I think it's something to remember throughout this video as we kind of, like, explore and try and understand the evolution of language. It's important to really look at words in context and understand their meaning. And some words which we might take for insults in some contexts and cultures aren't actually insults at all. A lot of the words that we use as insults today are actually homonyms, and they might have perfectly innocent other definitions. So, for example, you know, a non-offensive one would be bat and bat, in which case I could just say, I have a bat, but you need to look at the whole context around what I'm saying and everything like that to understand which kind of bat I mean. You need to figure out the context before you just make the assumption and assume someone is being offensive with a lot of terms. For example, you know, bitch, in a completely innocent context, means female dog or wolf. A hoe is a gardening tool. A fag is a slang term for a cigarette. None of these words, when used in the right context, are offensive to anyone. They're just words that mean innocent things. Dog, gardening, cigarette. So in England, for example, it would be perfectly reasonable to go up to someone, especially in the north, and say, oh, I'm going to stop hoeing for a bit and bum a fag off you. Which basically means I'm going to stop using this gardening tool for a little while and ask if I can have a cigarette from you. To bum a fag is to basically, it's kind of like to be given a cigarette for free. Like, you don't pay for it, you don't necessarily have to give them one back. It's kind of like borrowing, but you're probably not going to give them one back, you know. So, with all that in mind, we have to take into account context of words before we just outright get offended by them. That said, there are some words that are offensive regardless of the context, and one of those, it could be argued, is the C word. As I mentioned briefly before, out of 46 different swear words, Ofcom, which is the regulatory body for kind of communications and media in the UK, they ranked the C word as number one of the most offensive words in the UK. And you might sit there and think, well, there's no context in which that can't be offensive. But what we're about to talk about might surprise you. Now, as Kate points out in her book, there are some words that we just know are offensive and we don't really need to think about the why. For example, the N-word is steeped in racism and depression and has this vile, disgusting history. Other words, for example, bastard, well, maybe it doesn't have quite as vile a history, and the reason for it being offensive might be seen as problematic today. You can understand why it was used as an insult, because it originally meant you weren't a legitimate child, and therefore were unable to claim proper inheritance, so it kind of makes sense why someone would use it as an insult. Same with the N-word. It's vile and horrible, and we know that. We don't really need to think about why. But the C-word simply refers to female sexual organs, female genitals. And you have to think, okay, so compare it to something that has this like history of racism and oppression. How in some circles are genitals worse than racism? The C word is one of the oldest words that we have for describing our vulva or vagina. It's even older than those words, vulva and vagina. If we look back at the root of the word and its original meanings, we come across definitions like create, woman, wisdom, knowledge, cognition, even queen, which is pretty damn empowering, right? To say, you know, my genitals, my downstairs bits, they're a source of wisdom, they have the power to create, they're making me a literal queen. There's something very empowering about that. There's something that's like, yeah, Vagina, on the other hand, is a much newer word, and strangely, it's a little more oppressive in its history and origins and root. So our earliest discovery of it was in a 17th century medical text, which is why it might be preferred today, because, you know, it's quite clinical, it seems quite an objective term, but again, when we look at the root of the words that kind of made it up in their history, its origin literally means sheath or scabbard, as in something in which a penis is to be inserted. It's not a queen, it's not a source of knowledge, it's not something that creates, it's simply there to hold a penis. It's to hold the powerful tool, not to be the powerful tool. It reduces the function of the organ to something that is there to simply hold a penis, be a receptacle for a penis, rather than something that is awesome and powerful in its own right. Based on this, I think it's safe to say that vagina is a term coined by men to make them feel powerful, and once again, to reduce women and their powerful bits to mere objects, commodities, a means of holding stuff for men. Back in the day, before vagina was even a thing, the C word was not offensive at all. It was just a regular descriptive word for our downstairs bits. It was just a normal descriptive word for a body part like elbow or torso or head. Back in medieval England, sex and our sexual body parts weren't half as stigmatized as they are today. It was only kind of once more puritanical religious views became mainstream and became more powerful and became involved in politics that sex became so taboo and something to be hidden away and not spoken about, and so all sorts of words for the vagina and vulva, but especially the good old C word, then they became more stigmatized, then they had this air of shame around them, then they became something to hide away and almost fear. So let's go a little bit more in depth into the history of the C word. Back as far as the 1200s, the C word was so commonly used that it even started appearing in place names around the UK. Now we all know Britain is famous for its funny and often dirty place names. I mean, I literally grew up in Penistone. What more can I say? But that's nothing compared to Southwark's red light district in London, which was literally called Grope Cunt Lane. Because it's where men would literally go and have a feel of some prostitutes' lady bits. And this was just the first of many. Many other Grope Cunt Lanes sprung up around the country. And other similarly named places. So today, if you see any streets or areas with names like Grove Lane or Grape Lane, there's a chance that they were once called something like Grope Cunt Lane, and they were only renamed after the C word started to be considered vulgar. There were also a lot of people who had the C word in their surnames, and I would be very, very interested to know if there's any out there today who still do. So if you are one of them, please let me know. Shakespeare was also a massive fan of the C word, and he didn't explicitly write it into many of his plays, but he always hinted at it. I always find schools make learning about Shakespeare quite dry and quite boring, but he was genuinely a really funny guy with a filthy sense of humour, and he loved a good pun. So, like I say, he never used it outright in his plays, but he'd often find a way to sneak the C word in there. And so take the scene between Hamlet and Ophelia, for example, in which Hamlet feigns shock that Ophelia thought he might be trying it on with her and wanting to get into some, as he calls them, country matters. This whole thing reminds me a lot of like innuendos in the Aardman films like Wallace and Gromit, that they go over your head as a kid, but you watch them as an adult and you're like, oh. Shakespeare's like that if you really get into it. While Shakespeare loved a little bit of cheeky innuendo though, other authors were a lot more explicit and not afraid to outright use the word. So it's been seen in 15th century texts by Welsh poet Gwerthel MacCain, probably butchering his name, sorry Welsh people. It makes a ton of appearances in Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. Chaucer was not one to shy away from a good old C word. And 16th century Italian playwright Pietro Artino, again, probably butchering that, I'm sorry, he would always come straight out and use it. He said that he didn't have time for euphemisms and allusions when it came to talking about sex and the genitals and all that kind of stuff. He was just like, straight up, C word, bam, let me tell you about it. In all these kinds of texts, it was just there as another descriptive word for the genitals, in the same way that elbow, hand, foot, head was. Or in some cases, it was a little bit of a cheeky punchline, you know, to be like, oh, talking about sex, oh. In other places, it was used erotically to create a lot of sexual tension and try and kind of like work up the reader or show some kind of sensual scene between the characters, you know. It was a normal, nice word that they used. This, however, began to change around the mid-1600s. John Wilmot, Earl of Rochester, was a courtier of King Charles II and a poet and playwright in his own right. He also used the C word a lot in his work, but often in a really degrading and often disgusting manner. In 1684, he released a play called Sodom, in which he mentions the C word a lot and described them as love's common nasty thing, and that she that hath a will be a whore. Lovely. And honestly, this is only really scratching the surface. Throughout his works, including Sodom, but in others as well, his remarks against women and their genitals, and any woman who dared to be sexually confident in any way, his remarks about them were degrading, they were disgusting, they were insulting, they were nasty. It's clear that this man was a misogynist who had a disdain for women in general, and so he began to change words like the C word from a description of a body part to something that we should be ashamed of, something that made us as women evil and dirty. I swear if he'd have thought that women were the only people to have elbows, and I'm sure he would have also been writing about diseased and feral elbows. And while it's not necessarily known that this was the origin of it being used as an insult, it's definitely one of the big turning points, because as the 17th century went on, the C word became more widely used as a derogatory term for women and our bodies and our sexuality. It went from being merely a description to quite an insulting term. What's important to note is that this is also around the time that women and their sexuality in general started being policed. Something which we're still suffering the consequences of today, if we're being honest. Women were told, mostly by the churches and by men, that they could not be sexual beings unless they were being submissive to their husbands. Our bodies, our genitals, our freedom to express our sexuality were all shamed. We were told to hide them away, never talk about them, be modest, be pure, be ashamed of who you naturally are, because women are inherently lesser than men, and therefore we need to be ashamed of that. We can't be proud of that. As vaginas and vulvas began to be shamed and feared and seen as something repulsive, so did our words for them, including the C word. The next century, Francis Gross defined the C word as a nasty name for a nasty thing. And soon after, it became not just a gross term for the genitals, but it started to be used as an outright insult for people as well. As though there was nothing worse that you could be called than to be compared to a woman's genitals. That was the nastiest thing they could think of. The first recorded use of the C word as an insult for an actual person or human being was recorded in 1860, and it was pretty much all downhill from here. However, as the C word became this vulgar word to be hidden away, some authors did try and reclaim it and use it as it was originally intended. G.H. Lawrence, for example, used the word 14 times in Lady Chatterley's Lover, a book in which he tried to show a woman as a strong, powerful, sexual being who uses class to break down class divides, who uses it to kind of unite all people and say sex is what unites us, not divides us. But instead of showing how normal it was for a woman to be sexual and trying to bring the C word back to its former glory, instead he just shocked people and caused a bit of a stir, and everyone was a little bit like, bit too risque for us, mate. The rise in cinema also brings an interesting angle to the discussion, because the C word wasn't used in any films until 1971, and even then it was used purely as an insult rather than to describe the genitals. This was shown further in 1973 with The Exorcist. In the original cut of the film, the C word was used 3 times, twice as an adjective and once as a noun to literally refer to a character's genitals in the context of, keep your hand away from my genitals. However, in the final cut, the use of it as a noun was completely cut, and it was only ever used as an adjective to kind of make something seem more disgusting and more powerful and more shocking. The use of it to say, my genitals, was apparently deemed too far, too offensive. No one wants to hear that. As though it's more appropriate and less shocking to outright insult someone than to acknowledge a woman as a sexual being. And this brings me back to the beginning of the video where I mentioned Ofcom, who have consistently listed the C word as the most offensive of all offensive words. It's ridiculous. Some TV stations outright ban the words, others will only play after a certain time, and so on. It's crazy once you know the history how offended we are by such a, honestly, kind of celebratory term. I think it's safe to say that today, for the average person, unless you're Australian anyway, the C word is still pretty shocking to hear. I can't even say it on my channel now because I will be demonetized. The average person, however, doesn't really know its history or its linguistic origin or meaning. We just know that today it's used and seen as a vile insult. And it kind of really makes you think, doesn't it? Because why is vagina allowed in an educational setting, which has origins in assuming that the female genitals are only there to ever receive a penis, but the C word isn't, which celebrates the idea that the genitals are something powerful and wonderful and something to be celebrated and something that make you special. It's like this whole thing, isn't it, about how schools and curriculums are going crazy at Zoella because her blog dared to write a little article or a blog post or something about some sex toys, as though the idea of women owning their own sexuality, being in charge of their sexuality, women wanting to understand and learn more about sexual pleasure, as though that's some bad, horrible thing that should be hidden from children. It's ridiculous. And so with all this in mind, I guess I do just want to end by asking you a few of these questions. Have a ponder, go away and think, let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you have more thoughts, make a video response with your own ideas. I'd love to hear them. Because I don't think there's any right or wrong with this. There's just things to think about. Why do you think the C word is so offensive today? Why do we still to this day shame vaginas and vulvas so much? Why is it that to call someone a word for traditionally female genitals is the worst insult we can think of? How does this link to systemized and internalized misogyny? If you didn't know about the origins of the words before, now that you do, is there any difference in how you view the C word compared to vagina, for example? Do you think there's any way that we can reclaim the C word as an empowering term and celebrate it? Or is it too late? Do we even need to reclaim it? Can we just maybe change the meaning of something like vagina or something else? Or, I don't know, how do you view traditional meanings versus how we kind of interpret words today? In terms of reclaiming words like this, do you think that certain words can only be reclaimed by certain groups of people? How would you feel about a cisgender man, for example, trying to reclaim the C word and say it as a good thing? Consider the history of the C word compared to other insults. Why are some considered more or less offensive than others? Are there any words which you think we blow out of proportion and that we assume are more offensive than they actually are? Or are there any insults and words that we don't take seriously enough in your eyes? I kind of want to bring this back to the real world for a minute and not just think about hypotheticals. And let's be honest for a second. We're always going to have insults. As awful as it sounds, it's unrealistic to think that we won't. So if we start policing which insults we can and can't throw around, where do we draw those lines? How do we decide where those lines are? I mean, I'm sure we can all sit here and agree that using the N-word against somebody is wrong, but why? Why is it wrong? Why is it so bad? Why does that history of the word mean that we can't use it today? And in that same vein, what about the C word? What about calling someone a bitch, a bastard, a bugger, a pillock, a cow, a pig, a whore, a slut, a doo-doo head? Why are some of these insults worse than others? Why are some okay to call people and some aren't? A lot of these other issues that we do assume are okay or valid or that we can get away with are also kind of surrounded by a history of racism or sexism or homophobia, or they're classist or ableist or in some way offensive to a minority group. So how do we decide which ones are too offensive and which ones are allowed? And who decides what's offensive and what isn't? Let's take an example and say that two people get into a fight on the street. Person A purposely trips person B and they fall over and hurt themselves, right? And person B turns around and responds with, "Why did you do that? You blank." And they throw an insult out. And this whole altercation is captured on camera and posted on the internet, and millions of people watch it and they all weigh in on it. Obviously person A did something wrong by tripping the other person, and I think it's kind of very understandable that while person B shouldn't insult them, you shouldn't really throw insults at anybody, there are some cases where I think we understand that sometimes people are angry and upset enough to just throw out an insult, and I think it's a very natural human reaction. The question is, if this interaction is watched by millions of people, the fact of the matter is they're all going to judge person B based on what insult they throw out. How bad is that insult? How appropriate is that insult? Why did they choose that one? If person B calls person A stupid or a pig or an idiot, people might be like, yeah, that's fair, whatever. But if person B turned around and used, for example, a racial slur, people wouldn't be so forgiving. And while this is obvious, I want you to think about why that is. Why would it be appropriate to call someone an idiot in that situation, but not say the N-word? And again, please don't get mad. I'm not saying why to, like, I don't know, insinuate that both words are equal. Genuinely, I'm saying, why? Think about it. Because there is a difference. The other thing to consider in this situation is, if person B is throwing out an insult, does it matter what the identities of person A and B are? Does that make a difference in what insults are okay and what aren't? Let's imagine person A and person B are both black men. Does that make a difference? What if person A is an Asian bisexual woman and person B is a white male child in a wheelchair? There's so many variables that might make some insults acceptable and others not. And today I want you to think about why that is, where those lines are, and how we decide what the lines are. It's not straightforward. There's not one right or wrong answer. There's no universal answer in which, in all cases, word X is bad and Y is good. It's not as simple as that. It's a huge grey area. But it's definitely something worth thinking about, because so often we use language so casually and so many words just slip out, and we naturally gravitate towards certain words and naturally shy away from others without really thinking about the why, without understanding the history of our language, without understanding the true reasons behind it. And that's what I want you to start thinking about, and that's why I made this video today. And the C word is just one example. There are so many other words out there that have such a rich and interesting history, and some of those histories are really dark, but that's why it's worth understanding and learning and figuring out. And that's pretty much where I'm going to end this and leave you here today. But once again, if you want to check out that book that I mentioned that inspired this video, it is A Curious History of Sex by Kate Lister. I will leave a link down in the description below if you want to grab it for yourself. It will be an affiliate link, so if you do end up buying that book or anything to that link, it just kind of helps support me and my channel a little bit, and keeps helping me pay the bills when my videos get demonetized, because I'm saying the C word and talking about vaginas too much. So there you go. But yeah, with that in mind, please let me know your thoughts, either as a comment below or as a video or any way you want. I'm very, very keen to hear people's thoughts and experiences with this kind of thing. But yeah, thank you for watching today. Hopefully I've given you something to think about. Maybe you've learned a little bit of something. But for now, this is where I'm going to end this, and hopefully I'll see you all again very, very soon.